Brought to you by Charity Mobile, the phone company that supports life and family. 5% of your monthly plan price goes to your favorite charity. Mention offer code TRADITION for a special Christmas offer. Learn more at CharityMobile.com.
Banality at Mass, this sort of boring, worldly, despair-inducing, faith-destroying thing we keep seeing at Masses has become a subject of discussion again after the bizarre albs and chasubles and Mass implements and altars were seen at the Notre Dame consecration. And it's a subject I think worth looking at a little bit more. And who better to talk about such things than perhaps Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. He wrote a book called An Open Letter to Confused Catholics. I have the full text of it on this channel, if you care to check it out. He is the founder of the SSPX. He was excommunicated for doing something that had been canonically legal until basically they changed the law to try to stop him. And then, even then, the argument is easily made that what he did was still legal because of the first law of the church, the consecration of bishops being what he thought was necessary due to the church being in an obvious state of emergency at the time and still to this day. But that argument about Archbishop Lefebvre and the SSPX aside, in his work, An Open Letter to Confused Catholics, he is writing mostly to the Catholics of France, but his critiques of the state of the church at that time in France echo across the rest of the Western world. In fact, you'll hear, for the most part, things that will hit pretty close to home for you today, 40 years after he wrote this book. Now, it's worth noting, he wrote much of this before it happened in the 80s and 90s that the Vatican started really cracking down on liturgical bad habits, some of which their reforms were completely ignored. But in other places, they weren't. A lot of innovations you'll hear about in this were not allowed anymore. Thanks be to God for it. The Mass should be offered in a way befitting to what it is supposed to be, the holy sacrifice of the Mass. So you'll hear some things that may be a little dated here, but in other things, it will sound like it just happened this past week somewhere in the church. So here's Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre in his own words on banality and vulgarity and the profane being used to corrupt the Mass. Excerpt from An Open Letter to Confused Catholics by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre on the subject of banality, the profane, and vulgarity at the new Mass. Catholics are likewise bewildered by the obstinate partiality to banality and even vulgarity, in the manner in which places of worship are treated. Everything that contributed to the beauty of the buildings and the splendors of the ceremonies is decried as, quote, triumphalism. The decor must now be nearer to that of everyday life. But in the ages of faith, they offered to God the most precious things they had. It was only in the village church that were to be seen just those things that do not belong to the everyday world. Pieces of goldwork, paintings, silks, lace, embroidery, and the statues of the Blessed Virgin crowned with jewels. Christians made financial sacrifices to honor Almighty God in the best way they could. All this was conducive to prayer and lifted up the soul. This is a natural proceeding for mankind. When the three Magi went to visit the poor crib at Bethlehem, they brought with them gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Catholics are degraded by being made to pray in commonplace surroundings, multi-purpose halls that have nothing to distinguish them from any other public place, sometimes not even coming up to that. Here and there one finds a magnificent Gothic or Romanesque church abandoned, and a sort of bare and dreary barn built to one side, or else they organize domestic Eucharists in dining rooms or even in kitchens. I have been told of one of these celebrated in the home of a deceased person in the presence of his family and friends. After the ceremony, the chalice was removed, and then on the same table, covered with the same tablecloth, they set up a buffet meal. At the same time, only a few hundred yards away, only the birds were singing to the Lord around the 13th century church, decorated with magnificent stained glass windows. These readers who remember the years before the war will certainly recall the fervor of the Corpus Christi processions, with their numerous stations, the chants, thuribles, and monstrance gleaming in the sun, carried by the priest under the gold-embroidered canopy. The banners, the flowers, the bells. The sense of adoration was born into the children's souls and ingrained there for life. This primordial aspect of prayer seems greatly neglected. Do I hear somebody still talking about necessary evolution and new habits of life? But traffic problems do not prevent street demonstrations, and the demonstrators are not inhibited about expressing their political opinions or their demands, whether just or not. Why should God alone be thrust aside, and why must only Christians refrain from rendering him the public worship which is his due? The almost total disappearance in France of processions is not caused by a lack of interest on the part of the faithful. It is prescribed by the new pastoral theory, which, however, is ceasingly urging the, quote, active participation of the people of God. In 1969, a parish priest in the Oise department of France was expelled by his bishop, who had forbidden the organizing of the traditional procession of Corpus Christi. The procession took place nevertheless and drew 10 times more people than the village had inhabitants. Can one then say that the new pastoral style, which is, in any case, in contradiction on this point with the conciliar constitution on the sacred liturgy, is in accordance with the deep longings of those Christians who remain attached to such forms of piety? And what are they offering in exchange? Very little, because services have been greatly reduced. Priests no longer offer the holy sacrifice each day, and when they do, they concelebrate, and the number of masses is diminished accordingly. In country districts, it is practically impossible to attend Mass during the week. On Sundays, a car is needed to travel out to the locality whose turn it is to receive the sector priest. Many churches in France are permanently closed. Others only opened a few times a year. Add to that the crisis in vocations, or rather, the crisis in responding to vocations, and the practice of religion becomes yearly more difficult. The large towns are in general better served, but most of the time it is impossible to receive communion on First Fridays and First Saturdays of the month, for example. Naturally, there is no longer any question of daily Mass. In many urban parishes, Masses only take place by prior order, for a specific group at a prearranged time and in such a manner that the passer-by coming in by chance feels himself to be a stranger at a celebration studded with allusions to the activities and life of the group. Discredit has been thrown upon what are called individual celebrations in opposition to community celebrations, but in reality the community has split into small cells. It is quite common for a priest to say Mass in the home of someone engaged in Catholic action and other activities, in the presence of a group of activists. Or else one discovers a timetable for Sunday split up between different language groups, Portuguese Mass, French Mass, Spanish Mass. In these times when foreign travel is commonplace, Catholics find themselves attending Masses where they do not understand a single word, in spite of being told that it is not possible to pray without, quote, participating. How could they? No more Masses, or very few. No more processions. No more benedictions of the Blessed Sacrament. No more Vespers. Public prayer is reduced to its most simple expression. Even when the faithful have overcome the difficulties of time and travel, what will they find to slake their spiritual thirst? I'll speak further on about the liturgy and the serious alterations it has undergone. For the moment, let us consider only the obvious outward appearance of public prayer. All too frequently, the atmosphere of the celebration offends Catholic religious feelings. There is the intrusion of secular rhythms, with all kinds of percussion instruments, guitars, and saxophones. A musician responsible for sacred music in a diocese of northern France, supported by a number of leading personalities in the world of music, wrote, quote, "In spite of what is currently called, the music of these songs is not modern, the musical style is not new, but has been played in the most profane places and surroundings, cabarets, music halls, often more or less lascivious dances with foreign names. The people are led on to rock or swing. They all feel an urge to dance about. That sort of body language is certainly alien to our Western culture, unfavorable to contemplation, and its origins are rather suspect. Most of the time our congregations, which already find it hard not to confuse the crotchets and quavers in a 6/8 bar, do not respect the rhythm. Then one no longer feels like dancing, but with the rhythm gone to pieces, the habitual poorness, the melodic line becomes all the more noticeable." End quote. What has happened to prayer and all that? Happily, it appears that in more than one place people have returned to less barbaric customs. People have then submitted, those who wish to sing, to the production of official organizations specializing in church music. For them, there is no question of making use of the marvelous heritage of past centuries. The usual melodies, always the same, are of very different inspiration. The more elaborate pieces, executed by choirs, shows a secular influence and excite the feelings rather than penetrate the soul as a plainchant does. The words are all new, using a new vocabulary, as if a flood 20 years ago had destroyed all the antiphonaries, from which, even if they had wanted to make something new, they could have drawn inspiration. They adopt a style of the moment and are quickly outmoded, in a very short time, being no longer comprehensible. Large numbers of recordings purposely designed for the animation of parishes give out paraphrases of the Psalms and are frankly presented as such, thereby supplanting the sacred text of divine inspiration. Why not sing the Psalms themselves? A novelty appeared a little while ago. Posters placed in church porches reading, quote, "To praise God, clap your hands." So during the celebration, at a sign from the leader, the congregation raised their hands above their heads and clapped rhythmically and loudly, producing an unfamiliar din within the sanctuary. This kind of innovation, unconnected even with our secular habits, which attempts to put an artificial action into the liturgy, will no doubt be gone tomorrow. It contributes, however, to discourage Catholics and to increase their confusion. Nobody is obliged to attend, quote, gospel nights. Well, what can one do when the few Sunday masses are infected with these lamentable practices? The ministry to the assembly, as they call it, constrains the faithful to adopt these new gestures in which they see no benefit and which go against their nature. Above all, everything must be done in a collective manner, with exchanges or sharing of speech, of views on the gospel, and of handshakes too. People go along with this half-heartedly, as statistics show. The very latest figures indicate a further falling off, from 1977 to 1983, in attendance at the Eucharist, whereas personal prayer shows a slight increase. The pastoral assembly has not, therefore, won the people over. Here is what I read in a parish magazine in the Paris area. Quote, "From time to time during the last 2 years, the 9:30 a.m. Mass has been in a rather special style, inasmuch as the proclaiming of the gospel was followed by an exchange for which those present formed groups of about 10 persons. The first time this kind of celebration was tried, 69 people joined in, sharing groups, and 138 remained outside. One would have thought that with the help of time there would have been an improvement. This has not been the case. The parish team then organized a meeting to see whether or not to continue with the masses with sharing." End quote. One can understand how the 2/3 of the parishioners who had so far resisted the post-conciliar innovations were not enthusiastic about these improvised chatterings in the middle of Mass. How difficult it is to be a Catholic nowadays. The liturgy in French, even without sharings, deafens the congregation with a flood of words, so that many complain that they can no longer pray during Mass. When, then, will they pray? The confused faithful are offered recipes which are always accepted by their bishops, provided that they detach them from Christian spirituality. Yoga and Zen are the strangest, a disastrous Easternism which, claiming to lead to a, quote, hygiene of the soul, directs devotion in false ways. Again, what about the abuses of body language, which degrade the personality by exalting the body at the expense of elevation towards God? These new fashions, along with many others, have been introduced, even into contemplative monasteries, and they are extremely dangerous. They show how right are those we hear say they are changing our religion. Where indeed will they pray? That was the crux of his argument. Where will they pray? It is the critique of the new Mass, one of the ones that's usually the hardest to defend against, that there isn't room for a lot of private prayer during that Mass. Compared to any Eastern liturgy or the pre-conciliar Latin Rite liturgies that you could access, the Novus Ordo is very active by design, the active participation stuff. Because the new definition of active participation in the Mass ignores a very basic reality, that if you are praying at Mass, and if you're praying at Mass, you should be uniting your prayers to those of the priest at the altar, then you are, by every definition, before Vatican II anyway, actively participating in the Mass. But there's so much music now and gestures towards your neighbors and other such things that it takes away from the time that you could pray during the Mass. And there's still some time, to be sure, and if your priest is offering a more reverent version of the new Mass, then he will sometimes offer moments of silence for you to pray. and contemplate what you are participating in, and good on them for that. But those are all responses to the basic problems that Archbishop Lefebvre was pointing out in the 1970s and the 1980s, that the church was deeply in crisis and the new Mass was a factor in it. Major factor in it. You could go back and watch footage of all the sorts of liturgical wickedness that was going on at the time. Just completely fabricated on the spot liturgical practices done by priests, and how suddenly Mass attendance had been pretty steady and even growing before all that started happening, and then afterwards started declining rapidly. Where will they pray, he says. Turns out, for a lot of them, either in the privacy of their own home or maybe just starting there before they eventually leave the faith. That is what happened. And 40 years later, not much has changed, unfortunately. Let me know what you thought of this in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.